Our speaker today is Steve Snow. He's just finished his 2-year postdoc with the Refresh project. He's basically focusing on how humans interact with the systems around them, from heating to finances, air quality, and hopefully we'll hear about how all the dots go together. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the talk's sort of about connecting the dots between the social determinants and the physiological effects of air quality in offices. And so rather than just looking at air quality as a specific number or a certain group of compounds that go together and cause some physiological effect, a lot of my work is about designing technology that's useful that people can interact with. And also understanding the context of how these things happen. So actually looking at the sort of humans behind the humans in the offices where air quality may be an issue, and then how we can actually get towards people operating offices in a slightly healthier manner. So how we can join the dots between the social determinants and the physiological effects. So I'm going to be looking at 3 studies which are sort of summarised by what human factors cause poor indoor environment quality in naturally ventilated buildings. What are the physiological effects of the poor indoor environment, so what's happening to your insides, and how can technology assist people in improving their work environment towards hopefully this sort of panacea, as dictated by someone holding a hospital sign, of healthier people in healthier spaces. So who am I? I started off as an environmental scientist, and then I went and did environmental consulting, and I was doing a lot of, I was doing some noise monitoring and some dust monitoring, but it was only in the context of, if you're wanting to build something, you have to sort of knock stuff down, and construction makes dust, and so you get a baseline read of the dust, and then look at how that changes over the course of the construction, and if you're meeting the Environmental Protection Agency's targets, etc. But then I moved into some selling stuff. I was a solar panel salesman and an energy auditor, and that got me into a PhD which was more social focused, into looking at how we can extend the relevance of eco-feedback to users in the home. And so I've come from Australia as well, but but like my career's also been quite a sort of, it hasn't taken a particularly straight trajectory, but it has been always to do with sustainability, environment, and energy systems as well. So with buildings, obviously you've got that balance of being able to achieve good indoor air quality. But of course, if we all had the windows open all the time in air-conditioned offices, there's an energy trade-off. I don't get to go into that energy trade-off, and that's a bit of a pity, but it's something which future work might look at. I've tried to keep the talk relatively tight, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions as well. So this is part of the Refresh project. It's a EPSRC funded project for which MC Schraefel is the PI for. Is MC here today? She's not. MC is the PI for that. There's also University of Reading and University of Leeds. But essentially the big questions this project was looking at is, do poor indoor environments negatively affect occupant cognitive performance? And also, how do static and transient indoor conditions affect human performance? So I'm giving this talk, but there's lots of other people involved from different universities, people who used to be in Southampton but aren't anymore. And so this isn't my work, even though I'm focusing on my sort of bits of it. This is a lot of other people contributing. The mission was human-centred approaches to performance design to understand how the dynamics of air quality can affect performance. In order to understand, this is me putting my human-computer interaction hat on, in order to understand opportunities for interactive technologies that might help users realise a healthy work environment. So the first dot is what human factors cause poor indoor environment quality in naturally ventilated buildings. We're talking about naturally ventilated buildings primarily here because you've got building management systems, you've got heating, ventilation, air conditioning in brand new buildings which are typically designed to meet ventilation criteria, temperature criteria, and so these sort of things aren't much of a problem. But a great deal of even offices here are naturally ventilated, so people have to open the windows, and that's where you can, that's where indoor air quality can be a problem. Poor ventilation makes for high CO2. The scientific part of it is, I had to say this because I'm not very good at science, but the scientific part of it is that trees sort of take in CO2 and give out oxygen. Humans take in oxygen and give out CO2. So if there's a lot of us in this space, then we're likely to breathe out CO2. If that builds up over time, poor ventilation is correlated to lower cognitive performance, higher absenteeism, minor health symptoms. People start coughing, people start rubbing their noses. It's a big problem in schools because you've got the classrooms in, fairly small classrooms in winter where they keep the windows shut without thinking anything of it because it's cold outside. 25 kids are breathing out for 1, 2, 3 hours at a time. And so the actual cognitive performance of these kids is being lowered. But it's just not something we think about because I'm sure a lot of us here aren't sitting in our offices thinking, oh, have we actually got a good work environment? You just sort of take it for granted. Particularly with air quality, you've got this thing where cognitive decline precedes awareness of poor indoor air quality. So people become acclimatised to a room. If it's hot, you're like, oh, gee, it's hot. And you sort of know what 19 or 26 degrees probably feels about like. But you start becoming dumber before you realise you're becoming dumber, essentially. And that is a really big problem in these sort of open plan offices and potentially even these lecture theatres if they're beyond capacity of the HVAC systems. 75% of the UK building stock is built pre-1980, and that's something I wanted to focus on as well, because you do have a great deal of new, very sustainable, very good air quality buildings, but that is sort of the exception rather than the norm, because 75% of the building stock was built before the 80s, and a substantial part of it was built before the 50s, pre-war, sorry. Poor indoor air quality is caused by building-related factors like your window type. For example, these windows that open like that are slightly better for ventilating than windows that open like that. Window position, the room size and shape. So, for instance, that there is where you've got 2 windows being open, and so that area is quite well ventilated because the air sort of gets sucked through there, whereas the rest of the office may not be. You've also got human-related factors, occupancy. More occupancy makes for more CO2. You've got factors like acclimatisation to a room, because people don't realise that it's getting stuffy. And I'm sure we've all walked into a lecture theatre where it's like, or a house party or something similar where lots of people are in a small space. You've got individual factors. So I'm from Australia. I was wearing 4 jumpers when I arrived here, and now I'm down to just 1. But a lot of people just don't wear jumpers. You've got sensitivities to heat or cold or allergies and stuff. And that's sort of where the literature finishes. And I thought, hang on a minute, you've got people in these offices. A lot of my PhD was to do with the sort of social context of energy consumption and like how eco-feedback may be great for one sort of, techie mum or techie dad, but the other, like the kids might not like it. And you have to consider the social context.
Eco-feedback?
Eco-feedback, sorry, is typically iPads on your wall that tell you how much energy your house is using. Or it might be those, like with my smart meter, I got a little eco-feedback device that tells me how much money I've got left on the meter. So yeah, anything that informs you about your energy consumption. But yeah, I just thought social factors. I thought people aren't necessarily rational. How do social factors influence air quality in an office? So for the first study, it's exactly that. And my research question wasn't sort of how do, it was more do, because nothing's been written about this sort of stuff before. In my social science ethnographic tradition, I did semi-structured interviews with 23 people, and semi-structured interviews are ones where you've got a set of questions, but if people are passionate about a given topic, or if they're providing really good information on one of them, you allow them to continue to talk, rather than just say, thank you very much, next answer. So it's not surveys, it's not yes or no questions. It's these semi-structured interviews that lets people tell their story, and so they take typically a bit longer, and because of that, you can only ask them a certain number of questions. We asked about how people use windows, when they open the windows, when they turn up the radiator, habits, preferences, like do you like it hot, do you like it cold, workplace norms, etc. I've got the long list of questions back in my office. But the other thing, and this is a slight aside, hands up who's aware of Louis Theroux or who's watched a bit of Louis Theroux in their time. Like, Louis Theroux isn't necessarily a social scientist, but his interviewing skill is incredible with regard to these sort of semi-structured interviews, because you'll notice that he'll give an interview and the person will answer. And then Louis will be like, and then he awkwards them out, and then they're like, oh, so by that I mean, and then they give a much more sort of honest answer sometimes. And of course, Louis is talking to all of these, various different people, and often they dig themselves into deeper holes and stuff. But as an interviewing technique, it's really useful not to make people feel awkward, obviously, but just to let people reflect on what they said, and then add something to it, or say, actually, no, that's not quite right. And I find a lot of the best answers in semi-structured interviews come from just allowing people time to reflect on what they said. So yeah, 23 interviews, a range of different office sizes. Between 3 was the smallest, about 26 to 30 was the biggest, which is a photo there. I was only interviewing people in naturally ventilated offices where they could open the windows, and I was only interviewing multi-person offices between 3 and about 30. And there were some interesting results. So there's a paper about this which you can read and get it slightly more in full. But in terms of how do human factors affect air quality, people were saying, one person said, I wear contact lenses, so if I have the fan on my face then it dries my eyes out and stuff, but it's pretty hot in summer, and Carol sits behind me, and so I really want to make sure it's good for her. And so she was put in consideration of her colleague before herself. Usually someone else deals with the windows. They don't really touch the windowsill because there's plants on there and they're not my plants, so I sort of stay away from the window. That was quite a common theme of sort of the people who sit next to a window sort of own that window. And if you're new to an office, you don't necessarily feel like saying, oh, excuse me, I think the air quality is bad, can I open that window? So there's these small things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. You've also got the fact that there's gatekeepers occasionally, and by that I mean a third party who's actually dealing with that sort of stuff. Someone said, yeah, what we have to do if it's extremely freezing at my end, I have to send an email to the group secretary, then she sends an email to estates and facilities, and then they'll open it up, but there's a delay. That was one in Reading University. And so you've got these factors which you're not necessarily considering in the core environmental conditions in the office don't necessarily equate to rational actions by office workers to improve conditions. There's thousands of offices out there which I'm sure operate really well and the people know each other and that's fine, but it's just there are these exceptions, and if you're designing for technology in this space, you sort of have to understand that these sorts of things are possible. I'd love to do some more research on this, but essentially, yeah, humans aren't necessarily rational, and you had the things like the ownership of windows and radiators by the proximal employees, you had the gatekeeper effect, and then you just had social norms and politeness. Like, nobody has yet sort of opened the door, because if you're in a lecture, you don't want to be that one person who just sort of, excuse us, and opens the door just because you're aware that the air quality is bad. Study number 2, what are the physiological effects of a poor indoor environment? A little bit of background to this part here. So this is a graph looking at the existing literature of CO2 versus human performance, like human cognitive performance. There is a lot written about the effect of CO2 on cognitive performance, and generally if it's human generated, then it is likely to affect your performance above a certain level. But there's all sorts of discrepancies in the literature. So the square ones here is where they found an effect of human-generated CO2. So that means they've done a laboratory study where they put people in a small room, people have been breathing, wait like 4 hours long enough to get up to a really high level of CO2, and then they've done cognitive test battery components beforehand, and afterwards, yes, there's a significant difference. You've also got pure CO2. So there's inconsistency in the literature as to whether CO2 is just an indicator for the other nasties in the room, like the human bioeffluents and smells and like volatile organic compounds that come out of the paint and the carpet and particulate matter such as dust, there really isn't much of there's not a good idea about whether CO2 itself as an actual compound is causing these effects, or whether it's just an indicator for other nasties that are. So here, these studies, all of the circles, got a cylinder of CO2, or they introduced CO2 into a room to get the CO2 high, whereas the squares was just having people breathing out enough CO2 such that they get high. And all I'm really saying is that people have found effects or not effects at low levels, and effects or not effects at high levels, and partial effects, and so cognitive performance seems to be impacted more with the complex things, whereas the easy like reaction time tests and Stroop tests are less affected. So there's a lot of knowledge gaps here. We don't know at what level of CO2 is performance actually affected. It's not something you can just say above 2,000 yes, below 2,000 no. Originally CO2 was assumed to be an indicator for other pollutants, but now we're not sure. Does pure CO2 also cause cognitive decline in its own right? And then the previous studies are all, these are all laboratory tests. How quickly does cognitive performance decline during exposure to high CO2? So if you're just doing a test battery here and then a test battery there, you can say, yes, they're significantly worse here than there. But is it where as soon as you walk into a stuffy room, whoop, you're suddenly dumb, and you remain dumb? Is it something where it takes a long time, or is it something where you're actually good for about 2 hours, but then there's a magic marker, at which point the cognitive effects come? And because we've only been doing tests before and tests afterwards, all these temporal aspects aren't well understood. Which brings us to the next study, looking at how does high CO2 actually impact human physiology. Can EEG provide insight into the temporal dimensions of cognitive performance? So EEG is exactly what Taha's wearing there. It's something which measures the electrical activity in the brain really, really frequently, 500 samples per second. So incredibly high granularity information. We were hoping by using this, we could understand how cognitive performance varies with time, and how can we, and how the brain effects map to other physiological effects of elevated indoor CO2. Because nobody's really tried EEG for this. What you'll notice is that we're not competing with the literature who's just using cognitive test batteries, because you can't use EEG and say, oh, this person's like, their cognitive performance is low or their cognitive performance is high. But EEG can give you an insight into people's drowsiness. It's used for sleep state, so a lot of the sleep studies are using EEG to characterise the sleep state that people are in. You're either awake, there's N1, I think N2, and then there's light sleep, etc. And EEG is used for that. So we were interested in, can we use this to determine if people are actually getting drowsier as a result of the CO2 in the room. The protocol was such that we had people do a questionnaire first, then they came into the room, a small room, just like one of the offices, like your academics sitting down there. We shut the door and the window, and there was 8 minutes of them sitting there before we increased the CO2 by means of a cylinder. The CO2 becomes suddenly very high. We subjected people to 10 minutes of high CO2 before getting them to do another questionnaire. Had a short break with the stuffy room after the questionnaire. Then when people were ready, we opened the windows and the doors, ventilated the room, and had 10 minutes of ventilation, at which time the CO2 comes back down. We measured, as well as the questionnaires, we measured EEG, we measured heart rate, we measured respiration rate and skin temperature. We had 29 non-controls, which is where we actually gave them the gas cylinder, and 18 controls, which is where we just didn't add any more CO2. And so for those ones, it still goes up slightly because you've got 2 people in the room, but it gets up to maybe 1,000 or 900 rather than 2,500 parts per million. So that was the control versus non-control. And I'm sort of skimming over this fairly quickly. There's a lot which goes into this. We asked people, so in the questionnaires, we used some standard psychology, that's on the next page. We used thermal comfort questions. How do you feel at this time? That's a 7-point ASHRAE scale between cold and hot. We asked people the common sick building syndrome questions based on previous research, like have you got irritated eyes, stuffy nose, sore throat, are you experiencing mental fatigue? Do you feel there is insufficient ventilation? Do you feel the air is stuffy? Do you feel the air is fresh, etc.? We looked at the degree of sleepiness on the Stanford Sleepiness Index. Then we used a common psychology instrument called PANAS, which is Positive and Negative Affect Schedule, asking people if they're feeling any of these, not symptoms if you like, but it essentially gives you an overview of the person's affect, their mood, their mental state. So the findings. We found, this is just for the questionnaires by the way, so I'm giving you a very small number of findings between the baseline and question 6. Sorry, condition 6. I should ask, any questions to this point about the study? Because I'm aware I'm skimming through it, yeah.
So did you use a supercritical gas when you did
No, what we did was we also had because in this study people weren't blinded to the conditions. We said we're going to change the air quality. They weren't aware of the exact level, but they were aware that the air quality was going to be changed. See, the cylinder makes noise, so for the control studies here, we didn't inject any other gas, we just kept it normal, but we did play a sound through some, I did some EQs on the sound, made it pretty good such that people weren't able to tell the difference between me playing a sound for the control participants and me actually opening the cylinder for the... But essentially, yeah, people, unsurprisingly, had higher values for irritated eyes, mental fatigue. They felt there was insufficient ventilation. Like this is within subjects, and so overall, from the baseline to the end of high CO2, people were more likely to transition towards having irritated eyes, mental fatigue, etc. They were less alert, less inspired, less determined, less attentive, and less. And felt less active. This was using Wilcoxon's sign rank for these ones, because it's a continuous downward scale. Very briefly through the respiration rate findings, you would expect people to breathe slightly more with high CO2 because the body's pH is regulated by CO2 in the blood, and if you hyperventilate, that's you getting rid of all the CO2 that you possibly can in order to bring your blood pH down to a normal level. So we did find that people's breathing was increased slightly, and we're still doing work to correlate that to whether that was the CO2, but it looks like it is. Heart rate went up ever so slightly, but not as much. We're comparing this to findings from the Department of Psychology, who've given people a much higher level of respirated CO2, and heart rate increases robustly, as does respiration rate. So it seems like that these are correlated to the CO2. Respiration rate drops as the participant relaxes into the environment. As you can see there, the respiration rate just drops ever so slightly until the effect peaks out midway through. Respiration then becomes mildly positively correlated to CO2. Increases in peaks for non-control during the high CO2 period. This correlation then diminishes when you ventilate the room. So it only seems like the respiration rate is connected to CO2 for the period of time that we were controlling it. Because when we open the door to ventilate the room, sometimes it ventilates quickly, sometimes it ventilates slowly, and that actually depends on which way the wind's blowing because of the ventilation characteristics. And if the wind's blowing from a certain way, it just whooshes all the air out. We were doing this in an actual office because a knowledge gap too is that all of these studies have just been doing laboratory testing, sometimes even direct inhalation of the gas. Very, very it's a long way from a real life situation. So we actually wanted to conduct these studies in a real life room. The EEG processing is something which we had no idea how difficult it was going to be at the time, and so I can't say, oh, EEG is this great tool, you should all use it. It's taken a lot of a lot of effort to get it where it is, and just like Marco from Leeds has been responsible for this and a lot more processing of the restoration data. Originally, Visualises, also Obey, who's here, Amy, who's also here, have been responsible for processing the EEG. So you've got 20 points on the head. It's a dry electrode system. It's first we filtered data, so it was like a bandpass filter. You remove any very slow frequencies, any really high frequencies. We used an artifact rejection algorithm that was based from one of Kaushik Maharatna's students, who then gave it to Visualises, and that is a bit of a black box in itself, which I won't go into. It's based on a 10-second minimum variance. We then did a plus or minus 100 microvolt threshold cutoff with a 10-second moving median correction. And that's essentially because anything like below or above 100 microvolts isn't actually going to be brain impulses. It's going to be people sort of shaking their head, or it's going to be artifacts. And so we got rid of that because if you're taking the median and you've even, if you're taking the means, even if you have a couple of super outliers, just from people just going, you know, then that's going to throw it off, and so we did that correction for it as well. We then moved it from the time domain into the frequency domain, looking at the band power in delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. And what we were looking for here is, we were looking up studies of the sort of sleep studies where people have characterised what the onset of drowsiness looks like. The onset of drowsiness looks like an increase in theta and a corresponding decrease in alpha, where the theta moves from the rear part of the brain to the front part of the brain. And these results are really hot off the press because it's taken that much time and effort to process it, remove outliers, make sure that we're sort of ticking the right boxes within the EEG literature as well as the sleep literature. Because we had results once before, but then we found we weren't able to rely on them because it was essentially taking an average of an average of an average, and it wasn't going to be sort of robustly accurate. So, do you want to explain these as you've been working on them as of exactly this morning?
I can try. So basically,
stand up to it. I'm going to improve the air quality of this room.
So basically what we've got here is, we're just looking at theta and alpha because they're the ones where the ratio looks like it's an indicator of drowsiness. So for the time being, we've ignored all the other frequency bands. So this is just theta and alpha, theta in red, alpha in beige, or whatever colour you call that. And what I've done is a 2 by 5 by 3 repeated measures and over on it all. And we found significant main effects of all of those inputs, as well as all of the interactions that you get. All of those are significant as well. So because we've got significant interactions, I'm not reporting the main effects here because the interactions need to take precedent. So we can see that over the frontal area is where we've got the higher amount of power in both frequencies compared to the rest of the head, but you can see kind of crucially that this theta alpha ratio is far greater over the frontal than the rest of the head. And you can also tell that there is a lot more movement in theta than there is in alpha across the board. You can also see a really nice shape in that when we go from baseline to high CO2, then the power in both frequencies increases at high CO2 and then starts dropping when we do post-ventilation. It doesn't get back down to baseline levels anywhere over the head, but it reduces a little bit. Yeah, at the moment that's kind of all I can say until I have more. I usually created this an hour ago, so give me a week and I might know more about it.
No, yeah, thank you very much for that. I've been teaching and Amy's been working on this this morning. So yeah, EEG, just before I move on, a note with EEG, it's potentially really exciting. It's some people say it's like reading the tea leaves, other people say no, look, it's robust, it's used as long as you're not trying to, say, oh, we're using EEG for cognitive performance. If you're just building on the previous EEG literature who's used it to characterise drowsiness, if you can correlate the drowsiness to CO2, which we think we can, but we're not 100% sure because there's also other variables in there, then we might be able to determine the states at which, and the CO2 concentrations at which, and the speed at which people are becoming drowsy as a result of the indoor air quality. That was an old slide. So, the last bit of this is how can technology assist people in improving their work? So we've covered what human factors cause poor indoor environment quality in naturally ventilated buildings. We've covered some of the physiological effects of a poor indoor environment. And so from that, as HCI designers, as human-computer interaction designers, to expand the acronym, how can we actually help people? So like, rather than just saying this level of CO2 causes this much drowsiness, or rather than saying like, yeah, people are just a little bit too polite to actually open doors and stuff like that. I mean, because it's not a normal thing to do, right? And so how can technology assist people in improving their work environment? The motivation for this was particularly because cognitive decline precedes awareness. And so we're all in this room. If somebody was to walk in, they might go, oh gee, the air quality's bad, but we don't notice it because we're here. Office workers have no reference for air quality. That means, like, we know that water boils at freezes at 0 and boils at 100. We know 17 indoors is pretty cold, and we know that about 28 you're really hot, even if you're just in a t-shirt. But there's no reference for air quality. How many parts per million of CO2 is there in here? Couldn't tell you. What about VOCs? Also couldn't tell you. And now that we know that social factors influence air quality, that's an important contextual component to consider in there as well. Because if you start with the user and work backwards to the technology, then you really need to understand the context for which this technology is going to be built. So rather than just building a system and saying, oh, I hope it works here, you actually understand the people who are going to be using it. And so you can build the technology for them more efficiently. So the last study I'm going to be talking about is a little device that we built which measures the carbon dioxide in a room called the APHET. This was a third-year project. So this isn't me building it. This is a guy, I'm not even sure if I can say his name, but he's a gun. He is a very talented third-year electronic engineer who was really interested in these sort of human-centered design principles. He was good with, he's using a pipe, he's got an Arduino which drives the display. It's a little MHZ16 CO2 sensor, which is really cheap because, as we know, Part 3 budgets are quite small. And he's got a wireless capabilities which get sent to a server such that you can actually get the information from somewhere else. That's essentially what it looks like. I've got another slide describing it, but it changes colour as well as tells you a number. So based on the literature and based on some of the school guidelines, because guidelines don't really exist for offices yet. Some are starting to come in, but they don't really exist yet. So at 400 is what it is outside. If you 1,500, it's noticeably red, and that's based on some school guidelines where you should probably consider opening the windows. Up to 3,000 plus, where there's most likely to be an effect, and quite a bad effect, and it's going to be stuffy, and you'll probably be rubbing your nose, and it's poor air quality. The inspiration behind this particular design was from some of my previous research with energy consumption feedback. To understand the context of an office, we've got better things to do. We don't sit there on our computers, on our day-to-day jobs, scratching our heads wondering what the air quality is. We've all got priorities, and so people need to have information really quickly. Just need to, glanceability is key. So we build something which is glanceable. These sorts of things here are sort of artistic. They look really nice, as well as just being glanceable. So the power aware cord, I think, turns from blue to red based on how much current's going through it. The Watson is a similar traffic light system where it's green if you're not using much energy and it's red if you are using a lot of energy, but it also has the pence per minute or pence per, you can choose. the Nujvert project, if I pronounce it correctly, is an old coal-fired power station in Helsinki where in 2005 they got laser lights to project onto the smokestack, like onto the smoke coming out of the coal-fired power station, and if there's more smoke, the circle gets bigger. So essentially, if the whole city's using more power, it's going to be smoking more. And so the circle's bigger. So the whole city can just sort of look out their living room window at this really interesting style of eco-feedback. It's glanceable, it's more of an art project, but this was the inspiration behind designing the ATA system for CO2. And also a recent paper from 2015, they have, this was very much a sort of experiment looking in to see if giving school children and teachers feedback on their CO2 levels produces healthy behaviour change. Yes, it does. But this is what they used for that. We've got clock, we've got CO2 concentration front and centre. We've also got the temperature there and the humidity there as easy optional extras because temperature and humidity sensors are very cheap. But also because all of these things are correlated, because if you've got the windows shut for a long time, it's likely that the CO2 is going to go up as is the temperature. Yeah?
Did you get a chance to measure the CO2 concentration inside the lab?
In the lab,
Yeah.
they're pretty good.
Okay.
So yeah, 1,000, like I said, 1,500 parts per million is the recommended guideline to keep it below for schools such that your kids are fresh. I've measured it in the lab and it never gets higher than about 800, and that's because, or 9 I think was the highest that I've seen, because there's a CO2 sensor always somewhere close by, considering I've done this research. The reason behind that is because out there's a building management system that does building 32. It's situated on the roof and it's based on outdoor, whether it works or not is another thing, but essentially the computer is making sure that area is ventilated. So we deployed these in, I'll get to that later actually, and I think I'll get to that later too. Because I'm talking about the deployments, we deployed these in naturally ventilated offices, again, where people have control over it. Because if you were to give people something like this which they can't control, like in a lab, and it's really high, it's not actionable information, they can't do anything. We wanted to test it in naturally ventilated buildings where people could do something about it. So we deployed it in 8 offices just as a first sort of prototype. Duration was between 2.5 and 4 weeks, but we made sure that there was people, that the office had full occupancy for at least 2 weeks. The first study was, again, social science based. Later, we'll do like a traditional quantitative sort of scientific, does giving people CO2 information equate to lower carbon dioxide levels. This was a social science study looking at how people are going to be using this because people don't have any reference for CO2. So we just asked, we didn't say, right, this measures the CO2 and if it gets high, you need to open windows and 2,500 based on this literature is a good level. We didn't prescribe that. When we were deploying this in people's offices, we just sort of left it there and said this measures the CO2, if it goes red it's too high. 1,500 parts per million is when you can see that it's yellow, and that's based on a guideline. But we just want to leave it here for a couple of weeks, you can fiddle with it, like, there's no buttons, but just like put it in a good spot, make sure it works for you. And we found people were using these. People found some really interesting, we got some really interesting findings out of it. People used it for reassurance, saying, look, sometimes I turn around and be like, yeah, it's still green. If it's green, it's like saying, yeah, all right, mate, I got it, don't worry about it. So a lot of people missed it when it was gone. It was used for personal reflection. So saying like, all right, if I had 5 people because it was a meeting, then it would go up really fast. That was the times when I felt tired. My perceptions have made a difference. I don't know whether it did, it might just have been me. But at least they were reflecting on it. And it was used to inform behaviour, which we assumed that it would. People essentially saying like, yeah, I opened the windows when it got high. I mean, that's good. That's sort of what we're looking for too. But beyond that, people were saying that they might use it for support. So two people said, look, in this office, we just get along fine with open windows, but it'd be useful if I was in a bigger office with people who I didn't know. It's really nice to have this as a thing, such that I can base my requests on it. So like I can say, oh look guys, it's red, do you mind if I open the window? Whereas if it wasn't there, they'd be much less likely to say, oh, I feel like it's a bit stuffy, but I don't feel comfortable asking them. So these things can potentially trigger changes in the social dynamic of an office. Lots more research necessary, but in this initial sort of probe study, that's what we found. The implications for design from this, we found out the barriers to the use of the device must be low. People, like we said, do you like it sitting there in the office, or would you prefer to log on? Overwhelmingly, people said, oh, if I had to log on, to be honest, I'd probably just forget it. So it has to be there. It has to be, glanceability is a key, such that people don't necessarily have to look at the numbers. They can just see if it's green or red. Calibration is really important here. This is something which is ongoing work with the Refresh project, which Darshana, my colleague, is working on now, because people don't have any reference for CO2. So these little sensors are quite cheap, right? But are they good? And we really want them to be good, because we don't want to be giving people wrong information. People are basing their whole decisions on it, and you have to trust the device because you've got nothing else to test it against. So calibration is critical. That's part of our future work. Glanceability was preferred over persuasive technology. People didn't want something going ding, 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 ding. They didn't want noise. They didn't want lots of, like one notification to say your air quality is poor. That's fine. But things like goal setting, or like, who can bring the CO2 down the quickest, any sort of persuasive goal setting aspect people weren't keen on it. That it seems like unobtrusive companionship is the key to longer term acceptance, and that means nice aesthetics, something which doesn't bug you too much, something which can just sit there and is going to retain its relevance over the long term. Because bear in mind, over summer you've always got the windows open. So like poor indoor air quality is only really a big problem in winter when we shut the windows because it's cold outside, just to keep the warmth in. So we have to have these devices that can survive not being looked at much over summer, so that when their relevance increases in winter, they're still there and they haven't been put in the cupboard. These are important things to consider when designing technologies in this context. So the slides which I was going to come back to, we essentially use the technology probe approach, and this is something I want to put out there. If there are people in this room who are building technologies, and if you just want to test something small, particularly in a social context, a technology probe is a small, easily prototypable device which you put in an area to learn about the people who are there. It's got 3 interdisciplinary goals. The social science goal of understanding the needs and desires of users in a real world setting, that was me. The engineering goal of field testing the technology, which is what we're going to get to soon in terms of testing it against factory calibrated, much more expensive sensors. And the design goal of inspiring users and researchers to think about new technologies. And the process that we followed, I highly recommend everyone to consider as well. When you're building for people, if you put the user first, you've got the human-centered design cycle, which is actually now an International Standards Organisation number. This is quite big business. You plan the user-centered process first, understand and specify the context of use, which is what I did initially with the interviews. Specify the user and organisational requirements, so actually what does the technology need. Produce design solutions. Our first one was the APA. Evaluate that against the user requirements, and it's an iterative cycle which, after it meets the requirements, final design done. And that's something where we're teaching that at Southampton. It's Comp 2213 interaction design, but it is something where I'll always try to practice what I preach in a way, and that was the inspiration behind the paper. So are we there yet? Not quite. So we've definitely made a dent understanding what human factors or may cause poor indoor environment quality, and we definitely know that we need to be conscious of the social side of things rather than just the individual user side of things. What are the physiological effects of a poor indoor environment? Well, we know that poor ventilation makes for lower cognitive performance, but we don't know exactly how long that takes. Hopefully we've made a chip at that with looking at drowsiness, correlating drowsiness to CO2. And then how can technology assist people in improving their work environment? Work's ongoing with the AETHA. I would love it if these little AETHA type devices become as common as thermometers in offices, because it really is quite an issue. The degree to which cognitive performance is impaired, it can really be quite severe. But even if it's not severe, if you've got 56 million people in a country, and if you've got 75% of buildings built before 1980, and so a lot of them are like opening their own windows, and if you've got things like, if I didn't open the door, which is a bit of an odd thing to do, because I was like, whoops, sorry guys, I'm just going to interrupt Amy while I'm walking to open the door. But if I didn't do that, the air quality would be quite bad, because I've got suspicions that the HVAC system isn't quite extracting enough. It's fine if there's sort of half the people here, but I think it's a bit of a problem if everyone's in there.
That's not suggesting less people come.
No, it's definitely not. But it's like, if we had like a little AETHA device there, which we could all see, then if I'm not looking at it, someone can say, "Oops, sorry, it's not a question, I just noticed the CO2." It's like, "Oh, sorry guys, that's mine. Well, open the door. Can you open the door at the back? Thanks very much for that." So we really need technology. Simple little technologies look like this, understand how they're going to fit, and understand how technologies can sort of break down some of these social barriers which can occur, considering that it really is a big problem if you've got half the country just becoming slightly less smart over the course of several hours if they're not going outside. What are the next studies? We're looking at calibration. We're saying if lots of people were to make lots of devices, but they're all using cheap sensors, can we rely on these sensors? We're going to do further deployments of the AETHA. We're going to start with the user and work practical technology. And then, I guess this is the final slide. So, what can I do myself? What can each of us do ourselves? A start is just to be aware of things like this. If you go to a lecture or a talk and you hear the incidents of people coughing and going, if you hear more people doing that and you start to notice that it's a bit stuffy, then be that person who opens the door. Just have a chat to your fellow colleagues, because if you're aware of it, and if you happen to be working in a multi-person office, I'm aware a lot of us like sitting in the lab and it's fine, but just be aware of it. We're hoping to be able to build more AETHAs in order to do much more testing, but to actually give them out and to do longer term studies to see if the relevance, because we only did 3-week studies, people love them over 3 weeks, but if you were to come back in 2 years, is it still going to be sitting there? And if it's not, then has it really served its purpose, because it has to be able to put up with the summer where people have the windows open. So what I would say at this point in time, if you're techie, you can build your own. These sorts of things exist. We're hoping to get some more AETHAs built such that we can hand them out. But for the time being, just talk about it, be aware of it, and don't worry about sort of being that sort of slightly awkward person who opens the windows. So while all of that research is continuing, which it is not only here, but like all around the place, particularly Denmark Technical Uni, there's lots of stuff going on. In the meantime, just be aware and have a chat. So yeah, that's all I've got to say. Thanks for coming, and I'll take questions.
Hasn't evolution developed visual and audio CO2 monitor called the yaw? I was wondering, Doesn't that, has anyone correlated yawn with, so when people say yawns are contagious, couldn't they be contagious because actually they're measuring the CO2? When someone yawns, actually the CO2 is level, other people are starting to yawn.
That would be fascinating. The confounding variable there is the sort of boring lecturer effect. Are people coughing and sniffling a bit more and rustling around because the lecture is boring or the talk's boring, or is it the air quality? And that's quite difficult because one's behavioural, the other's
I
environmental.
imagine they interact.
But yeah,
Has anyone looked at the CO2 level? For example, when you were raising the CO2 level, was anyone observing whether people yawned?
no, I haven't. I haven't included that. I dropped off the study, the APHIS, and then did interviews afterwards. People definitely talked about it, and people like to show them off. People did use the information. It's like, well, guys, it's 1,005. I crack the window. Slowly it goes down. It did look like it was fitting into their everyday sort of lives. Longer term studies necessary to work it out. Whether how it correlates to like rustling about, coughs, yawns. Yeah, that's yep.
There was a 1987 paper written about yawning and CO2 that says there's no effect.
Can you send me that paper, please? Oh, no, I mean, that's still interesting. That's really interesting.
I could ask a slightly similar question, which is the fight or flight type response to the threat of CO2. Would that do something strange to your ECG levels initially?
That's something where we'll be able to correlate it with the changes in the PANAS scores. So the positive negative affect schedule, which we only did 3 times, baseline, high CO2 and post-ventilation. But we did ask people, are you feeling anxious, are you distressed, are you... And so we would be able to correlate, which we will later on, whether the higher PANAS scores for distress and stuff are correlated to the higher EEG scores, like say for less drowsiness. What we've done so far is we've just done statistics on the whole sample, whereas it's going to be really interesting in the future to be correlating certain things like, all right, here's everyone who got more anxious. All right, let's look at their particular EEGs. Here's all the people who felt more relaxed. Look at their EEGs and then see if we can pick CO2 as a factor within that. As yet, that's just more future work, which Amy and which Carleen are looking at.
All right, let's thank the speaker one more time. Next week is a WAVE seminar. We have a hopefully finishing student, Bernard, who is speaking on a speculative framework for